it's hard to find somebody who is better qualified to think about decision making in safety relevant environments. And please welcome David Owens.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I feel somewhat overdressed. Clearly, all conferences are exactly the same, right? Except pilot conferences. Well, I don't. I feel like I should apologize for that, but I quite like this tie, so I'm going to stick with it. I don't do the kind of normal presentations that you may have suffered in the past, so mine tend to be a little bit more interactive. If you don't talk to me, I will make you talk to me. Also, I use all sorts of inappropriate flight deck humor. Again, I apologize, but you guys should be used to that. Can I also say, for me, this isn't the first conference I've done since we've kind of crept out of lockdown a little bit. It's about the third one, but it's the first one where the male-female ratio is so significantly skewed that way. In the pilot world today, we only have about 5 or 10% female all over the world, which looking at this audience makes me just realize how significant that is. But we do have Jo here, who's at the front, who'll introduce herself later, who is a female pilot, even though we argue about that a lot. Right, so lessons from the flight deck. She flies helicopters, you know. So, this presentation. Let's just have some fun, shall we? So I'm going to talk a little bit about CAE, just briefly. There's a reason for this. I'm not going to bore you with corporate slides, but I want to show you who we are and what we're doing outside of the healthcare area, which you know. So we see ourselves now as a global training partner for all sorts of divisions. We have 95% of all US military pilot training. We do an enormous amount of maritime training for the crew on the bridge. We do civilian pilot training, huge, enormous organization. But that gives us both in-depth knowledge, but also responsibility. For us today, in aviation, our future, our success, our well-being is so closely linked to aviation that if aviation does well, we do well. If aviation's not doing so well, we don't do so well. So that gives us almost a mandate, an ethical responsibility to do the right thing. And you heard Stefan use the term noble causes. So this is kind of one of those. We want to share what we've learned, because we learnt it the hard way. Really, we learnt it the hard way. And we've got a lot to learn, but we've also got a lot to give. And that's where we want to come at this from. So we see ourselves as a technology provider. This slide, why do I give you this slide? Is to show you just how big our civil aviation division is. The little red dots are healthcare, but the blue ones are our aviation. So we really do cover the globe in a really big way. So the amount of data that we have, the experience is unprecedented. And we're starting to make use of that because we are becoming the eyes and ears of global aviation. We know more than the regulators, we know more than the aircraft manufacturers. So that's who we are. So within my team, we have Jo, who I introduced to you down here. We have a guy who's just been pinging us some text, Dr. Richard Kennedy. His PhD is in learning sciences, so he runs my learning science division. So we're starting to put that kind of knowledge into what we do and say. We have a team in CAE Maritime who aren't here, but just to show you the scope of what we do, CAE Maritime comes under my remit, and then we have our consultants. Now, all of these people are here to make me look smart, because I am just a pilot. I promise you, I am just a pilot. And that is not something that gives me any credibility, except that I've lived and breathed critical decision-making like you guys do. Our consultants, Dr. Sarah Flattery and Leah Hall, behavioral scientists, psychologists. As I said, I understand about 50% of what they say, and the rest of it just makes me look good because I nod. So that's who we are. Who am I? Well, as Stefan said, Captain David Owens, it's about 30 years I've been flying now. I think when I wrote that bio, it was about 25 years. I worked for Airbus. I was chief training captain at EasyJet. And I started with a little airline called British Midland, who are based here in Nottingham, some of you may know, which is why I know this area reasonably well. Many years ago, I was trained as a test pilot. I had special responsibility for the Airbus A350, and I was global head of training policy for Airbus. At a maritime conference about 2 years ago, a shipping owner, so multi-billionaire Greek shipping owner, said to me, why should I listen to you? And I thought it was such a powerful question because it really made me stop and think, why should you listen to me? Experience. And that's what I want to talk about today, experience. So, pilots and what we do. I want you to watch this. This is about when things go right. This is an Airbus A330. I flew this aircraft. Actually, I flew that aircraft. You might just about, if you're really good, recognize which aircraft it is. I want you to watch it and tell me what went right. Normal takeoff out of Manchester. A day when you don't expect anything to go wrong. See that? Long lens, listen. Major engine failure on takeoff. Close to a flawless performance. They brought the aircraft to a stop. Here it is in slow motion, but with the sequenced sound. Enormous energy swap as the aircraft starts to apply maximum braking, maximum reverse.
Tower Kestrel 314.
It's the first officer.
An engine. We're just holding short moment for the fire trucks. We've got no indications of a fire on our systems at the moment.
Okay, understood, sir. They're on the way now. You can see them off the right-hand side. They'll be in attendance very shortly. If you want to speak to them on 121.6.
Yeah, we've got that up, just waiting for them to attach.
Lovely.
Okay, so that engine failed at 105 knots. They performed what we call a rejected takeoff. They made a decision to do that in a fraction of a second, about 1 second. By regulation, we are required to make that decision in 1 second. 1 second. We're not allowed to any longer than that, and the aircraft does not have the performance necessary to stay on the runway. So 1 second decision making, critical, 350 passengers. How calm did that first officer sound? It's a bit obnoxious really, I thought, but he sounded so chilled out. Now, the reason for that is we train for that over and over and over and over again. And the reason we train for it is so that when it happens in the real world, if it ever does, and it's incredibly rare, it becomes something that is not, it doesn't push our stress levels beyond competence, right? It's just like, oh, here we go. I've seen this in the simulator before. Think about that with what we're talking about here today at this conference. What went right? Okay, so they stopped that great big engine. They didn't have that little left, all right? There was a lot left more than that. They stopped the aircraft on the runway, on the center line, and they were safe. And they kept it almost exactly on the center line. The first indication we know that an engine has failed on takeoff is we feel it in our bum. We feel it in our ass. That's the first thing the aircraft knows, suddenly switches to one side or the other, and we react. And our reaction time there is human reaction time. It's about 0.3 of a second, you know, bang. And it takes us longer to actually say, oh, we've had an engine failure. So that's what they did. They did that really well. How did they do that? Well, they carried out the correct actions. Sounds a bit obvious, doesn't it? But just think about it. How did they do that? Well, when it went bang, they detected and recognized the problem correctly. So they detected a problem, yeah. They recognized it correctly. They recalled the right action to do. It was drummed into them very vigorously. So, and not only did they remember what to do, but they did it. There's actually a difference between the two, right? I often remember what to do, but don't actually do it. So they detected, recognized, recalled, and reacted what to do. Why is that important? So back at Airbus, I started my new job as global head of training policy for the manufacturer 3 days after a quite famous accident. So are you aware of an accident in the South Atlantic to an Air France Airbus A330 called Air France 447? So you may remember the scenes of the tail of the aircraft bobbing in the Atlantic, and it took us 2 years to find the black box. That was a big one for us at Airbus. I'm limited about what I can talk about that and Hudson River and other accidents because of a thing called Annex 13 of the ICAO United Nations regulations. But one thing I can tell you about that is it took up a lot of my life because that was a good airplane on a reasonably good day with a good crew who'd been thoroughly trained, who had a minor problem, and everybody died. How can that happen? How could that happen in the world today where we do all of this? Well, there's a key, and this is why I came up with this model. Detect, recognize, recall, and react. They knew something had gone wrong, but never once ever did those pilots figure out what it was. Never. They never figured out what it was. If you don't recognize the problem, you're not going to remember what to do because you can't draw the link, and you'll never react properly, and you'll never solve it. So every problem, just about, that you've ever had in your life, in your medical world, driving your car, getting breakfast today, if you don't detect, recognize, recall, and react, you can't solve the problem. And that's what went wrong with Air France 447. Forget all the other stuff you've heard. Nobody in that flight deck thought this aircraft is stalled. Because if they had have done, they've been trained thoroughly what to do. So we suddenly realized that we had a gap. They were unable to do the right thing because they didn't know what was going on, and their decision-making was flawed. So some very senior people in Airbus said to me, have a think about that. Have a think about why that failed and what impact that has on things like decision-making. And that started a really interesting journey about decision-making, which is what I want to share with you today. So how did they do all of that? It was their training. So what happened to these guys on that day with that emergency? They did as they were trained, and their training was resilient. I don't actually like that word that much, even though I introduced it into aviation at EASA a few years ago. Basically, for me, the training withstood the rigors of the actual event. And that's what failed in Air France 447. It was resilient in the real world. One of our problems is everything we ever experience as a pilot takes place in a simulator. Nothing that's ever happened to me in a simulator has actually ever happened in the real world, because we design it not to be that dangerous, right? Okay, so because of that, for some people, there's a gap between the training in the simulator and when it suddenly happens to you in the real world. I don't know how we get around that, okay, because it'll always be a simulator. So the truth is, we now start to think about, I've trained you, I've checked you, I've tested you, I've observed you, but is that going to be useful if that really happens in the real world? We don't know. So I want to start off by talking about the first two little bits, and then we'll have some fun. Now, I love this, because normally I do this to a bunch of pilots. I haven't got a clue what you know all about this, right? Senses and bodies, and I've seen all the bits out there. I know what you know about this. So I was told when I was at school there are 5 senses. Yeah? I Googled this. There are about 35. Some of them I don't even understand. Actually, most of them I don't understand. Anyway, look, it doesn't matter. They're all fallible. Agreed? Oh, that's good, because pilots go, no, no, I'm infallible. Right, so pilots suffer from tunnel vision, and we're task-focused under stress. We become focused and fixated on the end of the runway during an approach, and it can be quite dangerous. Become deaf, dumb, blind, have all sorts of difficulties. Of course, that never happens to you guys, of course. So from detect comes recognize, but everything that goes into our heads comes from our senses, right? Okay, maybe not, but let's just say it is. There's a long philosophical discussion we could have about that, but I believe that everything that you know came into your head via your senses. If that's the case, try this. This is one of my favorites. I like this because it's so topical. Who's that? Actually, do you know what? I don't think it is, but when I saw it, I thought, oh, it's Adele. Okay, beautiful. Agreed? Anything wrong with the picture? Ooh, see? All the pilots are like, no, she's beautiful. Right, I'm going to do something to this picture. I promise you I'm not going to fake it. I'm just going to turn it upside down slowly. So there, I promise you, no tricks. I'm just going to turn it round and, ah! What does your brain do? Your brain can't cope with that mouth being upside down. Your brain turns it up the other way and says, that's a beautiful mouth. You look at the eyes and you go, they're beautiful eyes. It doesn't work. Human brains don't work very well with faces. It's the first thing we recognize when we're born, probably the last thing we recognize when we die, and we're not very good at that. You can't even recognize a human face. What hope do we have with everything else that we try and do? Now, you can actually train that out. Certain observers, and a few of you actually said, you may have seen this before, but there are lots of these on the internet. I find them really fascinating, because I can't see that. On one side is a beautiful woman, on the other side is something really quite horrific. But it's actually the same picture. Isn't that extraordinary? Brains can't cope with that. And of course, you've all seen the gorilla, right? I'm so bored with that gorilla. But there was a lot of research done about this, about how fallible we are to seeing or not seeing things like this gorilla, how focused we become. This is what happens to pilots. When something goes wrong, we can become massively focused on it, and all sorts of things that are going on around us, we can't hear, can't see. We can't hear the co-pilot. We can't hear air traffic control. In Air France 447, the computer said stalled about 90 times, and nobody went, oh, maybe we're stalled. Nobody heard that voice saying stall, stall, stall. Think about that. Inattentional blindness, the invisible gorilla. Pilots can't hear, see, or think during stress. We tried to take that out. We tried to train pilots like the rejected takeoff. We do it over and over and over and again in the simulator so that the stress doesn't become blinding and incapacitating. So, most of my presentations are basically universal. I'm not really talking about what it is to be a pilot. I'm talking about what it is to make critical decisions or experience this sort of thing in life. So, we've just published a book called Maritime Team Dynamics, which I was telling Stefan about earlier, which is lessons from the flight deck for the maritime world. Because they've reached out to us and they said, we've got a lot to learn about this human factor stuff from you guys. Can you help? Yeah, so we're helping. Matthew Syed and Black Box Thinking. You've read that book? Most of you have seen that book, right? Yeah? If you haven't, I recommend it. It's very well written. Matthew's a very, very interesting guy. He used to be #1 table tennis player in the Commonwealth, believe it or not. He's a doctor of psychology, really interesting journalist, tall, thin, very funny guy. We disagree a little bit about some things, but I actually really quite rate what he does and says. He wrote this book about black box thinking, which is about you guys, right? It starts off talking about medical situations. And ironically, the first person in that book where it all started was this guy, Martin Bromley. Any of you met Martin? Any done work? Yeah? I know he does a lot of work with medical people, talking about human factors. He was, funnily enough, he was on a medical call-in about a year and a half ago with A&E nurses, a global conference. And during the conference, he had a heart attack. There's something ironic about that, isn't it? I tease him about that all the time. So Martin's a friend of mine. He's a student of mine. So aviation is actually quite a small world. So a lot of the human factors that came out in his sad story about his wife and how she died all came about, or his understanding of what could have gone wrong was the human factors training that we did together years ago. So that's that story. So a lot of what we do is all linked. And this is the Human Performance Council, which Joe chairs. The Human Performance Council is looking for excellence in this area across all of the divisions. And that's when we're going to start to talk to you guys about this, because it is completely inappropriate to say that you can learn from us. We can learn from each other. Okay? We seriously are not the world's experts on this subject area, but we are open to learning, and that's one of our strengths. So we're constantly looking at what we do and saying, can we do better? Okay, that was all a bit serious, wasn't it? So here we go. What can we do next? You know what we've never really looked at? What pilots look at. So with a major Asian-based operator on a small island somewhere off the coast of, anyway, without saying the name of that Asian operator, we've fitted all of our simulators with eye tracking devices. So we're now looking where pilots look. And we don't know what it means yet. We literally don't know. We don't know what good is. We don't know, oh, he looks at that. Because observation is not about what you stare at, is it? Sometimes it's what happens out the corner of your eye, right? So we don't know. So what we're going to do is look at the pilots who perform well and look how they use their eyes and then use that as a model. So we've done away with the old days of saying, oh, that was wrong. Yeah, going to teach you how to do that better. We look at what happens when it goes right and try to model that and use that as one of our lessons. That's a big change for us. You know, even, well, since 1903, we haven't been doing that. So this is a new change. We're looking at this. So we've started to build very exacting measures of performance. So linking simulators like the one you've seen here with telemetry data so we can see exactly precise inputs from pilots and start to measure that against the quality of their performance. And my goodness me, we're starting to see some interesting things. We're at the very, very naissance of this. To give you an idea, one sneaky thing, that rejected takeoff. You know I said we've got 1 second to decide to do it. 5% of all pilots did it ahead of the human reaction time. They are not gods, they're cheating. Right? They know it's about to happen. It's not a surprise. So we've learned a lesson there. Because you can only train startle and surprise if you're actually startled and surprised, right? Ha! I knew that was going to happen. So we're doing a lot of technology stuff. I just wanted to share this just for a moment to show you where we're starting to take our simulation. Okay. Would you like to know some more? We want to talk about the decision-making stuff because that's when it gets really cool. So here you go. And would you like to know some more? So I am here to tell you today, this is some work I did with Air France back before I had the lockdown stubble. I did this work for Air France after Air France 447 to all of their pilots, all of their cabin crew, all of British Airways, Iberian, that sort of stuff. So whenever I walk on one of their aircraft, everybody kind of thinks they know me, but they don't know who I am. But they've seen these videos, okay? So my job was to look at the future of training and try and figure something out. And when I did a lot of research on decision-making, everything I thought I knew about decision-making was wrong. And the biggest fundamental lesson I learned is that I have never, ever made a bad decision in my entire life. And neither of you. Do you believe me? Do you? Some of my ex-wives wouldn't believe me. Anyway, so what I want to say, is that I'm going to prove to you you've never, ever made a bad decision in your life. Okay? I think that's really cool. So forgive yourselves. If you look back now and think you did, you didn't. So here we go. That's the A350 flight deck, which is quite cool, lots of buttons. None of us know what any of them do. Don't think that we do. That's all fake. We talk about something called airmanship, right? Airmanship, airmanship. I don't know whether you have something similar. We talk about airmanship. It's the knowledge, skills, and attitude to fly safely, efficiently, and effectively. Knowledge, yep, skills, and attitude. You've got all, that's the same for you guys, right? There's no difference, right? Knowledge, that's all you have. Knowledge, skill, great, okay. And do you do everything safely, efficiently, and effectively? Safe? Yeah, I hope so. I could be a patient one day. Efficient? Yeah, that comes into healthcare, right, for sure. Effective, what does that mean? Actually, that's tailored to each individual organization and the way they work. For us, if we had a flight that was perfectly safe and perfectly efficient, but all the passengers got off at the end and went, I'm never flying with you again, that's not particularly effective because we'll go bust. So what you do has to do the same, but I don't know what that measure is. Okay, but everything comes into this. So we've been using this for quite a while. When I first gave something similar to this, it was to I think it was the Royal College of Danish Surgeons, who'd heard I'd done some work on decision-making, came across to Airbus to have a look. And when I started to do this, I said, well, do you know we don't talk about flying anymore? I don't fly the airplane. Do you know what I do? I operate it. We talk about operating. And that, again, that's the same for you, right? I mean, you invented that word, I think. So it's not about the task, it's about the overall complexity of whatever it is you're doing. So whatever you do, all of you, no matter what your roles, it's knowledge, skills, and attitude to perform that task safely, efficiently, effectively. Attitude, I think you know about that. We started to talk about professionalism, the people who go the extra mile, the ones who do a little bit more. Do you know those people? Yeah? Yeah. They're often somebody who can be slightly annoying, but also you look up to them a bit. Yeah? They do the extra bit. They've read that paper. They've gone to that extra conference. They've learnt something more. We now know that that can make the difference under critical situations, and I'll talk about that. So this is the start of it. This is about detect and recognize. But now I want to talk about the other parts, and this is where it starts to get really interesting with decision-making and the bit that I enjoy the most. Think about the last really important decision you ever made. Cake? Maybe. Well, what about breakfast, yeah? You all chose something for breakfast. Joe had a complete big fry-up, and I was very jealous. I had a yogurt, because my body is a temple. So, why is that funny? So, think about the last important, or any decision. Which cake would you choose? Actually, do you know what? I must be getting older. I quite like the look of that one. I really don't like the look of the E numbers, one of those. But most people, and the product placement is there. What can we conclude? We conclude that pilots like chocolate. That's not very useful, is it? What's interesting is not why, but how did you decide? How did you decide that you wanted to eat the chocolate cake? How did you do that? Is it interesting? I think so. Do you in your profession, in your daily lives, have to make critical decisions? Yeah, me too. Okay. Can we make better decisions? What if we could? What if we could develop some training that gave you better skills at making decisions? Because everything we do at the end of the day is about those critical decisions. So that's what we decided to do. Started off, I asked 100 pilots, what is a good decision? They didn't get a single sensible answer except from this guy on the left who's an old friend of mine. And do you know what he said? A good decision is when I don't get the blame. Genius. Has anybody else got a better definition, by the way? I tried. I found nothing in the literature. You'd think that we'd have this everywhere, wouldn't you? People would have, like, you know those things that are above somebody's desk, like the buck stops here, or a good decision is when. I found nothing. I tried. It's got to get the right result. It's got to be effective. It's got to be timely. It's no good saying, I've made a really good decision, I'm just 3 years late. That doesn't work. It's got to kind of use the least resources. Great decision, but we can't afford to do that. And it's got to be kind of ethical, acceptable, safe. But that's all I came up with. And increasingly, I go back to what my friend said. Good decision is when I don't get the blame. We teach this subject in aviation, and we always have done. And this was the big breakthrough, because I suddenly discovered that we were talking. Right, I'm going to turn the language down, aren't I? We were talking nonsense, okay? So these are the acceptable decision or accepted decisional making methodologies used by psychologists, right? So you can look at them all down there, right? Flippism. You know what that is? It's an American word, right? It's when you toss a coin. There are people who live like that. It's called flippism. You toss a coin, and heads or tails, what should we do? Satisficing, a guy called Herb Simon in the 50s got a Nobel Prize for this. This is when you do just enough. It satisfies what you need it to do, satisfying. The rest you can probably figure out. The one that's growing importance for us is the last one, intuition, your gut feel. One of my favorite psychologists that I ever worked with, who's sadly no longer here, used to say to crew, if you're flying one day and you've got a feeling that something's not right, it's probably because something's not right. Hold on to that, because we're starting to realize, and you guys know this better than I do, that this gut feel, it comes from non-consciously processed information. I've had this happen to me a couple of times when I've gone, do you know what, it doesn't feel right. And it's because my brain had figured something out, just not at a conscious level. I couldn't verbalize it. Really important. So the first three are called the rational models, you know, spreadsheets and that kind of stuff. The last four are called naturalistic or natural decision makings. And then there's flippism, which is just a bit of a joke in the middle. But it is a some people do make decisions like that, right? I mean, the next time there's an FA Cup, somebody will decide who goes first. What do we teach? Right, so this is not a complete list, but we in aviation for a long time have been teaching these mnemonics. I can't normally say that, quite pleased. Mnemonics. Look, grade, Enmate, Arcia, Dodar, Sadie, Sockford. Oh, gosh. Most of them have got a D in, so you get to a point where it says decide, and they turned out to all be wrong. So, what do psychologists say? Kahneman. Anybody know Kahneman? Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. Not a very good book. Kahneman's still alive, I believe. He was certainly last year. If he were here on stage, he'd say, has anybody read my book? And of course, everybody in the audience who's there knows Kahneman says, yeah. And he said, liars, put your hands down. You didn't get past the first chapter. And he's probably right. It's dull, it's dry. One of his students is a guy called Gary Klein. Anybody come across Klein's work? This is where it gets really interesting. Now, Klein and I have quite a big disagreement about this because he doesn't believe you can teach it. I believe that anything can be taught. So he sends me quite rude emails from time to time saying, stop using my book. Right, okay, so he wrote this book. This I recommend. This is a good read. Okay, don't get commission from this. It's about 25 quid on Amazon, which is clearly why psychologists are so well off compared with pilots. But Sources of Power, it's got nothing to do with that. It's about his discovery of the true process of decision making. And it's really, really interesting. So, how do we make decisions? This was my big, fun discovery. What do we use? All of them. Well, none of them. We don't use any of them, really. We don't do that at all. If you've got loads of time, you know, we could do those rational spreadsheet-style decision-making things, couldn't we? But as a passenger, would you feel happy if the engine went bang at 105 knots and I said to the first officer, can you just get a quick spreadsheet out? Let me know what you think. On balance, what should we do? It's not quite that simple. But for all critical decisions, Klein discovered that we did something specifically, and it was none of those. He developed a theory called recognition prime decision making. Sounds awful, doesn't it? We don't like phrases like that. You live with that sort of thing much more than we do. But to a pilot, that's too complicated. But it's basically, I'll tell you more about it in a bit, actually. Recognition prime decision. It's not that bad. Don't worry. There's a flow chart there. Forget that. We'll get rid of that. Klein was called in by the Pentagon to do some work on real-life critical decision-making. He studied firemen because that's the only people he could find who on a daily basis put their lives in jeopardy. We don't, you don't, except crossing the road when you come here in the morning, that sort of thing. But we don't do that, but firemen do. And the reason he did that is because he couldn't study the military. Even the Americans wouldn't start a war just so he could study how they did. Oh, I can't believe I just said that. Oh, can we just delete that bit? Thanks, it's not live, is it? Okay, cool. So what did he do? Right, it all came about because of that boat. You know what that boat is? Whoa, big. Yeah, you can have a free beer tonight for that one. So this is the USS Vincennes. In 1988, in the Straits of Hormuz, they shot down, by coincidence, an Airbus. Now, looking at the audience, about 50% of you aren't old enough to remember that. However, they shot down an Airbus, and it was pretty tragic. And one of the problems that the Pentagon had with this event is it was the best ship with the best crew, the best captain, who earlier that day had already made a brilliant decision. And they shot it down. Interestingly, in the last few years, new data has come to light that actually explains a lot more what went wrong. But they literally shot down an Airbus because they thought they were being attacked by it. Okay, so what did Klein discover? Well, interestingly, when he looked at the firemen, he first asked them, I've just seen you go into a house fire, you did this, this, and this. How did you make that decision? We didn't. Yeah, you did. I saw you make decisions. No, no, no. And this went on for about a year of him and his associates trying to figure out how these firemen were making decisions. And there are lots of interesting stories in the books. And they started to realize that everything that we thought we knew about decision-making just didn't fit the model when it became critical. So what did they do? After quite a bit of research, quite a lot of experiments, they discovered this. This is what we do, what you do, what I do. An experienced individual recognizes, does that sound familiar? Recognizes the problem. And that comes from their expertise. Now, naturally, we don't like that word, do we? There's a little bit, but expertise, meaning you've got some considerable experience in performing this task. And what they do is they recognize it because they've seen or heard something similar before. So it becomes familiar. And if it becomes familiar and using that experience, they can very quickly know what to do, evaluate it, plan it, and they do it. So this is how you do it. You go, oh, I've seen something like this before. I can do this, this, and this. Oh, no, that won't work. I'll do that. Yeah, that'll work, right? Does that feel about what you're right? Okay, that's really cool. Because I know that's what I do. I'm pretty certain that's what you do, but nobody had ever thought about it like that before. That's not how we thought in those days, and this, of course, was the early 90s. We didn't know that's how people made decisions. It's also how it can go wrong. An expert does not compare different strategies, use the rational methods, or use mnemonics, ever. And what's frightening is if we try to make them do it, it crushes the expertise and makes for less effective decision making. So, is that interesting? I think, honestly, when I came across that, I thought that was about the most interesting thing I'd heard in years, because it explains a very large number of aircraft accidents. To this day, the majority of airlines, training organizations, still teach the use of mnemonics to try and solve a decision-making problem. So having said that expertise has got a lot to do with it, the advantage of being an expert on a subject and trying to make a decision is that you've got lots of things you can model it from. But it also slows the decision-making process down because you've got more to consider, more experience. For us, young co-pilots don't have anything like that experience. They make decisions much more quickly. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not effective. But for years, we've always promoted people to command based on experience. Now I know why. Because of decision-making. So, knowing about the different methods can open your eyes to how you make decisions. Being shown your own limitations, like the fact that you use your senses, and that doesn't always go well. Practicing. Kobayashi Maru. Right, I want people to be really honest. Who knows what the Kobayashi Maru is? Yay! Honestly, pilots are either liars or they're just boring. So Kobayashi Maru. Kobayashi Maru comes from Star Trek. Okay? There's actually a book on the wisdom of Star Trek. Kobayashi Maru is the unwinnable experience, the unwinnable scenario. If you want to train decision-making, you actually have to give people a scenario where there is a true decision to make. In almost all of aviation training today, we don't do that. We give them an obvious answer. The engine failed at 105 knots on takeoff. What are you going to do? Fly to the Canaries? No. I'm going to stop. There's no real decision making there. Do you see what I mean? No choice, no decision. So what we like to do now is start to give people more complex problems to solve, which requires them to use this sort of thing. So explaining, training, and observing this kind of decision-making process is powerful and very valuable. Now, here's a bit of history that demonstrates the effectiveness of this. This is an interesting accident. It's actually a really good film starring Charlton Heston. So this is what we call United 232, or the Sioux City incident. Okay, John Boy Walton was in it, if any of you are a certain age. So this film is about this aircraft which crashed. 232, a DC-10, July the 19th, 1989, they crashed at Sioux City. There's actually footage of it crashing, because what happened is the tail rotor, what we call the third engine in the tail, it catastrophically failed, and little bits came flying out which severed all of the hydraulic controls, which meant that no flight controls on the aircraft worked. That's not good. Trust me. We don't train that. In fact, the first thing that happened is the captain asked the flight engineer, there was a flight engineer on this aircraft, for the checklist for this event. And the engineer said, well, there isn't one. But these guys invented a solution using their experience. And they almost got it down, but the vast majority of passengers survived, including I think it was a 6-year-old little boy who was thrown out of the overwing exit at about 100 feet and now has a medal for the lowest ever free-fall parachute jump. But a lot of them survived because of a brilliant piece of problem solving. When NASA gave this to 30 other experienced crews following the accident, none of them got anywhere near the runway, but these guys did. How did they do it? Massive experience. So, interestingly, this one, another Airbus. It's an A300B4, I think. So in 2003, they took off from Baghdad. They had a bad day. Sometimes, you know you have bad days? Boy, did these guys have a bad day. So they took off out of Baghdad, which in itself is not a great thing to do. You can see who they work for. So they were bringing, obviously, lots of Christmas presents back, and they got hit by a rocket-propelled grenade. It missed the engine, but it wiped out part of the left wing, which meant they lost all the flight controls. Nothing worked. And the captain said, hey, I read a book about this. I haven't seen the film. The film's much better. But he read a book. Because he'd read the book, he had the experience. And recognition prime decision-making kicked in, and he said, I know what to do. We're going to use asymmetric thrust from the engines. If I put more thrust on the right engine, we will turn left. If I put more thrust on the left engine, we'll turn right. If I put lots of power on both engines, the nose will come up and down. They got it on the runway. The only thing was, bad day, remember? They couldn't keep it straight on the runway because they had no controls whatsoever on the ground. And the aircraft drifted off the runway and came to stop in a sandy kind of desert area near Baghdad. And they were like, yay! Run down the steps, heroes. The military got there very quickly after and said, don't move. Why? Because they'd come to rest in a minefield. Yeah. That's a bad day, right? So they came to rest in a minefield. But they did a brilliant job because they'd seen something similar before. Absolutely brilliant. This is where it comes from. It's all experience. And it doesn't have to be yours, it can be somebody else's. So remember when I talked about professionalism? Reading about what's happened to other people can be just as powerful as experiencing it yourself. It's really, really impressive. Don't force people to do anything else. Allow them to naturally make these decisions. What's interesting is it applies to everybody always without exception. And that's why if we do that, it can't be wrong. It's the best that we can do. And nobody can ever ask you to do any more than that, surely. So, here we go. Which way do we go? Conclusions. I don't like conclusion slides. Lately I've been just leaving them blank because I don't know what the conclusion is to this. I just want to learn from you and join resources with you to write our own conclusions over the next years. That's a genuine offer, by the way. You've never made a bad decision in your life. Why? Because every decision you ever made was based on your experience. You didn't deliberately go, oh, I've got a choice, A or B. A is good, B is bad, that's going to hurt. I'm going to do B. Because even if you did, it's because for some reason you decided to do B. There's no such thing as a bad decision. Every bad decision you've ever made is through the clarity of hindsight. You went, oh, shouldn't have done that. But at the time you didn't think that, did you? So think about that. With every accident there's ever been in aviation, we have the clarity of hindsight. We look back and go, gosh, those pilots made a bad decision. Not anymore. They obviously did the best they could because, ouch, it hurts if you get it wrong. So they didn't do that. Nobody deliberately chooses the wrong choice ever. We only have our senses, our experience, and our training to work from. It's only when we look back in time that we can say, oh, that was a bad decision. Be kind to yourself, don't do that. Or your manager does. Oh, that was a bad decision. But, like an expert, one source of help is getting another opinion, being open to the opinions of others. That's why I'm here today, to share that knowledge, share that experience, share that journey of learning, and to learn in return. Because by doing that, my goodness, it's a force multiplier. We can make some really powerful moves. Be kind to yourself, and remember that everybody else makes the best decision they can as well, even if you don't think so when it happens. They did their best at the time. Civil aviation is pushing ahead and pioneering research in the human in the loop. That's Joe's Human Performance Council for Excellence. CAE is at the forefront of this work in many areas and industries. Our true strength comes from our ability to work together. This is an example. And that's what I really, 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 really want to do. So from me to you, let's start working together on this. Let's start building a future where we can share experiences and make things work better. And remember, you've never made a bad decision in your life. Thank you.
Don't walk away.
I was going to say, you don't want me to walk away, do you? No.
Apologies. So that was a fantastic presentation, I think. I have comments and questions, but I'm sure you have. So let us know what you think. Is there anything you want to comment on?
Yeah, sorry, two questions. The initial Manchester Airport coming up to V1 engine failure on takeoff.
Yeah.
Shut down the starboard engine. You see it veer across
Yeah.
off the left. Both thrust has come on to stop.
Yeah.
There's extra braking.
Yeah.
Why did the thrust reversers come on the engine which had failed?
So, did you all get that question? So, in the video of the rejected takeoff, we call it rejected takeoff, and you said the name of the airline then. You can actually see who it is, can't you, from that tail? Thomas Cook. They did a very, very good job of that rejected takeoff. We, as I said, we have 1 second to make the decision. What we don't have is time to figure out which engine has failed. So, as a matter of procedure, we select reverse power on both engines so that we don't have to think about it. It's just it's what we call a conditioned response. It's a knee-jerk response. So on an Airbus A330, the stop is close both thrust levers, select both reversers to maximum, and allow the auto brake to bring the aircraft to a halt. And that's the same on all Airbus, always, at all times. Pretty much certain that's true of almost every aircraft everywhere, because we don't have time to figure out which engine has failed. We just slam them shut and go for it. Theoretically, there are cases when that could make the situation worse because you're putting more fuel into an engine that could be on fire. But on balance, that risk is seen to be less than using the reverse. Interestingly, and this is going to get really complicated, we don't use the reversers to actually reduce the stopping distance. So we don't need them because we have to assume that they've both failed. It's the brakes that do all the work. But on a rejected takeoff like that, if they were a bit faster, the brakes get so hot that they catch fire, always. And the aircraft certification, it has to be able to survive a full brake fire on a rejected takeoff for 5 minutes without any external help. And we do that down in Toulouse. We used to put that aircraft through that thing, let them catch fire, sit there for 5 minutes with a valuable prototype burning away before the fire services are allowed to get in there. The reversers can reduce those temperatures and help that sort of situation there. But you've got some aviation background, right? Or just an interest, yeah? Okay, cool.
Sorry.
That's right.
Going to the training side of things, during COVID, obviously hundreds, maybe thousands of civil aircraft have been laid up in either Nevada or similar places.
Yeah.
Where the climate's more suited to the corrosion and everything. Has there any additional training been given to putting these aircraft back into
Mothballed, yeah. So, yeah, a lot of work goes into that, a lot of engineering side of things to ensure that everything's okay. But to be quite honest, they're incredibly reliable, which in itself is a little bit of a challenge for us in aviation because nothing ever actually goes wrong in the real world. So there's a generation of pilots like me, I've never had an engine failure or anything like it. Whereas the previous generation, nearly all of them said, yeah, I had an engine failure once, that occurred. What we have done globally is quite a lot of training with the pilots as they return. Because the aircraft is one thing, but the pilots who've been sitting around for a year or a year and a half without going near anything, they've got a lot to learn. What we've discovered is that they don't lose the skills. Okay? They can still fly just as well as they ever did. What people lose when they don't practice these things is the residual capacity to deal with other issues. So, you know, we always say if you've ridden a bicycle, you never forget how to ride a bicycle. You can jump back on it. I've started riding again seriously recently, but I would never take my hands off the handlebars again. It was the sort of thing I did when I was a kid, right? So the thing is, you can do it again, you can fly again, do all of these things, but it takes up way more of the brain power to do the simple stuff. And that is the threat. So we have to get them back to feeling comfortable and competent and confident of that very, very quickly. And that's been a challenge. That's been a challenge. Equally, we also know that when an organization is under stress, there tends to be more accidents. You imagine having been an airline pilot over the last 2 years, working for whichever airline, you know, that must have been really, really, really stressful. We have had a significant number of suicides, but there must be people who've been massively distracted. So these are things that we monitor and try to manage.
Although with experience comes resilience, most of the clinicians working in the front line are doctors or nurses in training. Most of the human factors workshop are concentrating on addressing the human factors to eradicate or minimize error. But shall we accept that human error cannot be eradicated?
Correct.
And shall we shift our mindset from error eradication to recognition and repairing?
My answer to that is yes. So truthfully, there is a theory that the rate of human error is almost constant. And in fact, human error is vital to achieving creative solutions, you know, all these sorts of things, creativity. What we talk about in aviation, have done since about 1978, is managing these errors, trapping these errors, rather than doing anything else. But what we have done, which is critical, is we've created or tried to create what we call a just culture, where we want people to talk about the mistakes that they've made so that we can all learn from them. Now, forgive me for this is an area of ignorance for me. From what I understand, there's still quite a long way to go in the medical world to achieve that same thing. So what we say to people is if you've made a mistake and you own up to it, you've almost got a free pass for the mistake you've made, provided it wasn't critically negligent or deliberately corrupt in some way, because we think that that is more powerful than any form of punishment or correction. And we also believe that the more people who do that in that open culture, the better is the overall resilience, because other people then will come forward and say, I think you are making a mistake. As I teach my team this, I say, if you agree with me, don't bother saying anything. I'm only interested if you disagree, because that's how you stop me from making a big mistake. That's quite powerful. If you're interested in that subject, Joe, that's what you're going to be talking about. We talk about threats and errors. Threats come at the crew, errors come from the crew, and Joe will be talking about how you manage that in a critical environment later on today. That's the closing presentation today. But you're right.
I was interested, you were saying about mnemonics, and everyone in here will probably recognise we use A to E, that's probably the most common mnemonic we use.
We used to use Dr. ABC, the cabin crew used that, so all,
More letters to the end.
yeah.
Same stuff.
Yeah.
But one of the things, and you do see that, which can lead to faulty decision making
Yep.
for whatever reason. So I agree with what you're saying, but do you think those mnemonics play a role
Yes.
in allowing people to
Absolutely,
develop that?
particularly during training, because one of the critical things is you forget one of the steps. One of the most vital steps is to do a review of the decision you've made, just to say whether it's still fit for purpose. And that's often where we see things go wrong, but you're absolutely right, yes. So I'm not saying that mnemonics are wrong. but they're not the total solution, which we thought they once were. So, and all of them, well, nearly all of them got a D in there, which is decide. And what I was asking was, how do you do that bit? So yeah, gather as much information as you can, talk to the crew, assign the task, make a decision. How do I do that? That's the bit that's missing. But yes, everyone. Interestingly, some research has shown that 96% of all critical decisions are definitely made using recognition prime decision making, and about 70% of all non-critical decisions are as well. And we as human beings, we often fake our decision-making process. So I've got one for you guys. Have you, the balance sheet, which is, I'm going to buy a new car. It's going to be this one or this, and you have a list of good points, bad points, good points, bad points, good points. Gets to the bottom, that's the wrong one. Right, I'm going to change the parameters to give myself the right answer. Yes or no? Right, that's how that form of decision-making doesn't actually work. You've already decided. Now you're just making the mnemonic fit your decision. One critical thing we do now teach, and I think this will transfer to the medical world perfectly, is we are now trained not as the captain to express our decision first. We are trained to say to the first officer, what do you think we should do? Yeah?
Something I teach in
Yeah.
team.
Good, yeah.
People to
Yeah.
say, for like a team leader, to say, I know what I'm thinking, but what do you guys
Yeah.
think?
9 times out of 10, they come up with a much better solution, which again makes me look good. So.
Because you go,
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. Bloody hell, I think like, yeah.
I have a different decision method, but this is wrong. My husband hates me for it, and it will be, oh, there we go. If I have a choice of 2 different outfits, I genuinely don't know which one I want. When I ask my husband, he hates the fact that I always go with the other one, and it's because the other option's been taken away from me, and if it makes me upset, I know that's the other one I want. So there's another one for you.
Yeah. Not all decision making is rational. I think that's fair enough, right?
Are you aware of any psychology work into the difference between health and aviation and all the rest of it, in that we're not on the plane or in the fire?
So there is a fundamental difference. And I've spent some time explaining this outside the aviation world, which is, for a pilot, if I get it wrong, I normally hit the ground a microsecond ahead of everybody else, or unless we're going backwards. But so there is a degree of jeopardy, and that's a very interesting question. So I have not looked at that, but I assume in your world, even the worst mistake that could ever be made in the operating theatre medical situation, it's unlikely that the practitioner is going to come to harm. Whereas for us, we often are just as badly hurt. Yeah? Now, please, that's a big generalization. It's outside of my area of expertise. The only life I know is the one where I'm on board the aircraft. Where that has changed slightly lately, or for the last 20 years actually, is I teach. And I am liable not just for what I teach, but the consequences of what I teach. And that can come back to haunt me. So there was a crash, Afrikia 330, that crashed on takeoff somewhere, and they were my students. Equally, the Helios crash, do you remember that one, where it was hypoxia, 737 took off out of Larnaca, was flying to Athens, and everybody passed out because they had no oxygen on board the aircraft. The pilots made a mistake. That captain worked for me in a previous life at EasyJet. That's when it starts to shift, and mistakes that I have made could kill a lot of other people, but not me. So there is a degree of that. But for the vast majority of people in aviation, anything that goes wrong impacts them just as soon as it impacts everybody else. So yes, and that changes your mindset, right? I think.
I know a pilot who were talking about this, and we say now that there's this statistic that healthcare incidents, the equivalent of a Boeing 747 crashing every month, and he was like, well, there's 14 cabin crew and pilot, 14 crew on that plane. So if every month you went and executed 14 members of healthcare staff, maybe it would be...
Bit of a radical policy, but there might be, you know, when I talked about some decisions have to be slightly ethical, you know, but yeah. Ooh, Joe, avoid healthcare, right?
We'll do right now around
Everyone in here is thinking, who would I put on that list?
Ah, yeah, yeah.
If I may make one comment here, I think if my interpretation is right, so you strongly advocated, I think, the role of experience, right? So you recognize something, and simulation could be called experiential learning.
Yes, absolutely.
There's an agreement, maybe in healthcare, that somebody who already has visibly been working there for 20 years, maybe more trusted than somebody who is a very junior healthcare provider. And I remember when I was a student or just started to work as a physician, when patients recognized that I was looking young, very different from today, and they said, have you done that before? Or how many times have you done that before? And it was an embarrassing question, of course, to me, and I gave all kinds of embarrassing answers, but it clearly showed the value of that, and you, in a much smarter way than this gut feeling, brought back the importance of that. So experience seems to be a key element, and I remember having recognized situation and walking back away from that situation, being happy because I recognized them, and experience could have been I've been told about this, or I've went through a situation like that. So I think that's a very, very powerful message.
And to add to that as well, the latest research from us is we've realized that experience isn't the right word. It's what we now call exposure. It's meaningful experiences, because you could do 20 years, but if nothing ever goes wrong, you won't actually learn something. It's what happens during that time that's significant. So we now talk about exposure rather than experience, but it's kind of the same thing, but you understand the importance, right? Yeah.
Another comment, sorry for abusing my position here, is it's opening the door again to have that conversation between aviation and healthcare, just like it could open the door to other professional areas as well. Because if we agree on something very generic, like it's the exposure that matters, then it doesn't so much matter whether you're flying an airplane or you do something else, right? So instead of analyzing how this world is different from that world, and if something works here, it does not automatically work there, and so on, it's an opportunity to think about the commonalities between all of these areas and say, well, if exposure works here, it probably works there as well, and maybe that's where we could focus on. That's what I take away from this. Thank you. Any other remarks or comments? If that's not the case, I would like to do two things. So first of all, I would like to give you a big thank you for that. It was a fantastic presentation. And I personally love that presentation because it showed the touch points, the commonalities I talked about between the two worlds, but I would rather say between the one world of people who have to make decisions in some kind of a critical context. So I think this conference, this group as well, right? I think that's a very powerful opportunity to go down that path a little bit more and think about what that means and what it means to our work in education and training, and certainly in our work that is clinical, where all of this has to be applied one way or the other. So I think that's a fantastic opportunity, and I would like to use that opportunity also to remind you of this afternoon's presentation where Joe Watkinson is going to talk about threat and error management, which perfectly fits into the whole agenda, and which also drives, I hope, the message of the power of this Human Performance Council. This is a unique group that I think we should all profit from, and it's not that group that we should profit from, but it's the topic, right? This could be all of our topics. So I'm very much looking forward to this afternoon.